I told you it's spooky season. Time to face the ultimate art fear. As an artist, nothing scares me more than having to paint hands. Look, I've been doing this for over 9 years now, and to this day, the most daunting thing you could ask me to paint is a bunch of hands. Now, if you've been an OG subscriber to this channel, you probably remember my old hand tutorial on how to draw hands in a more sketchy line art type of way. Today's video, we're going to focus a little more on how to paint hands and how to add dimension and color. And just so you know, today's video is way easier than that one and only has 3 steps. I know it sounds way too good to be true, but I promise this is the easiest hand drawing tutorial that you have ever watched. Yes. Before we dive into this video, I quickly want to let you know that this month I'm doing Inktober for the first time ever. I've never done a challenge like this before, but every day of October I will be posting a brand new inked illustration over on my Instagram, so make sure you're following me there. Link is in the description. Okay, back to the video. If you like this video, then please remember to give me a big thumbs up and hit that subscribe button down below if you haven't done so already. But with all of that said, let us now look at my 3 super simple steps on how to paint hands. Alright, so for the purposes of this video, we're going to work through 3 views of the human hand. And just so things are easier to explain, we're going to work off of 3 references. So here we have the palm of the hand, the back of the hand, and a slightly more complicated side view of a posed hand. No matter how long you've been painting for, it always helps to have references handy. Pun fully intended. If you've watched my video about my top 6 art tips, I explain this further. Go watch it after this one, I highly recommend it. Also, this is quite sped up, but if you feel so inclined, feel free to paint along. I have the references on screen for this one as well as in the description below, so you can look at those too. But for now, let us dive into these 3 steps. The first reference we're going to use is a simple palm of a hand. Step 1 is to pick a shadow color and just roughly block in the overall shape of the hand. Don't worry too much about the exact proportions or the details. This step is simply about getting the gesture down. This particular hand is super simple, with the fingers only slightly splayed and the palm is fairly flat. So here is what the blocked in silhouette looks like. This is the real meat and potatoes of painting hands, so put your listening ears on. We're going to grab a pressure opacity brush. I'll leave a Google Drive link to the one I use in the video description so you can download it. And we're going to use a mid-tone shade. Make a new layer and clip it to the silhouette so that you're painting inside the lines. Now we're going to look at all the areas where light hits the hand. But here's the trick, do not oversimplify it. You see, a lot of the times we tend to paint too much information into a small space. Here's what I mean. Here's 2 cylinders. I'm going to paint the first one in an overly simplified way. So if it were in flat lighting and I wanted to show form, here's what I would do, right? Midtones on both edges, a strip of shadow in between. The top would have a highlight area on one side and shadow on the other. Of course, we have to show a drop shadow just to imply that this is in fact flat on the ground, and a rim light so we know where the edges are. Pretty straightforward. But boring. Oh, it's so boring. Why? Because I've done too much of the work for you already. You see, one incredibly powerful lesson I've learned over the years is that any good art is a collaborative experience between the artist and the audience. In other words, your painting will only engage the viewer when it invites them to fill in some of the gaps. So coming back to the cylinder, this time we're gonna leave some of the rendering purposefully abstract. So for instance, instead of fully rendering the barrel of the cylinder, let's try leaving most of the bottom half in shadow. And instead of having an all-round rim light, let's only have little bits of the edge that actually catch the rim light. Instead of having it perfectly smooth, we're gonna add little specks and scratches, and instead of a perfectly cylinder-shaped drop shadow, let's make it a little more diffused. Now, as you can see, the second cylinder has way less information, but is somehow way more interesting. Why? Because our brains love puzzles. We love to fill in any gaps of information that's just instinctive. So when something is oversimplified for us, we just get bored and disengage pretty much instantly. So now... Hi! So now when we look at painting the forms of the hand, instead of overtly simplifying each finger into 3 cylinders or the palm into 3 separate masses, let's look at only providing just enough information that you can tell the form, but also having some mystery. So for instance, we know that the fingers are overall cylindrical and are divided into 3s. So instead of rendering the entire finger and then adding the divisions, maybe we could simply render in 3 mid-tone areas on one edge of a finger, leaving the rest in shadow. We know the thumb has 2 divisions and is separate from the muscle in the palm, but if you look at the reference here, it appears as one big area of mid-tone. The rest of the palm has many little lines, but we can also pretty much flatten a bendy rectangle on the upper half of the palm. Now, if we go in and blend the edges, maybe even add very slight highlight tones, we have a really good overall form. There's enough information on there to tell you that it is a hand, but not so much info that you're easily bored. Why? Because we've painted the areas where ambient light would actually hit, not areas where we think it will hit. So always remember to leave some mystery in there for the viewer to unwrap. And now that we have the form in place, it's time to take the study a step further and throw in some little details. For instance, let's look at adding a thumbnail. Unless the character has polished nails, the nail bed is usually the same color as the fingertip. So essentially, when I paint nails, all I really do is grab a white or a really pale skin color and with a tiny hard-edged brush, indicate just the tip and maybe the sides of the fingernail. I don't generally paint polished fingernails, no reason why to be honest, maybe I should start doing that. Next, let's look at adding some folds and creases. Again, we still don't want to oversimplify. The way light works is that details are often lost in the shadows or in the super highlighted areas, so really we only want to be indicating lines and details in the midtones. Also remember that the lines on the hand don't all appear as darker marks. Depending on how the light falls, we can also show tiny creases with a bright highlight tone. So there we have it. There's our first hand. Now let's look at the second reference. This time we're gonna paint the back of a hand. But with this one, we also have a ton of hue variation to consider in step 2. But let's begin with step 1, blocking in the overall shape. The reason I prefer to do this with a flat shadow tone is because it helps me really look at the actual silhouette rather than what my mind thinks the silhouette would be based on the 3D form. So for instance, I might assume that the fingertips would be visible at the end of every finger because the palm is flat. But if you look at the reference, we only see 3 of the 5 fingertips. Don't be daunted if the silhouette seems to look nothing like the reference. We haven't added the form in yet. You have to trust the process. So for step 2, before we jump into adding the forms, let's first look at the color story here. Clearly the knuckles are super red. You'll find this is common in people with paler skin, where you can see a lot of redness at the joints where the skin is thinner. But you'll also notice that the skin is a warmer, more neutral skin tone closer to the wrist. And in the second section of the fingers, there's an almost blue tinge to the skin. So before we look at the values, let's quickly block in this overall hue variation on its own layer. Okay, now that we have that, we turn that layer off, make another layer, and we can start looking at the form. Like we talked about before, we're going to try not to oversimplify the forms. So we're going to leave the outer edges of the fingers and the hand mostly in shadow, as well as the fingertips. We're going to add a bit of light to one side of the knuckles and maybe even some lights for the veins that are showing through the skin. We're not too worried about the details just yet, we're just looking at the big forms at this point. Once all of this is in place, we can now bring back the hue variation layer. You can play around with the blending modes. I generally set the hue variation layer to hue blending mode or soft light sometimes, and lower the opacity enough that it still tints the layer below, but doesn't overpower the values. Now we can go over it again and blend the tones so that we have a good idea of the forms and hues, but again, leaving some of that mystery in. And finally, with step 3, we're going to go in and add some of those smaller details. This time we have some really sharp lines at the joints of the fingertips, as well as the webbing between the fingers. We can also show some fine hairs close to the wrists. In this particular hand, there is some detail in the nails of the thumb and the first finger, mainly a white crescent at the base and a pale strip at the tip of the nail. We're just going to quickly clean up the edges of the hand, and there we have it. Hand number 2, sorted. And now we're going to attempt the most complicated hand of them all. Don't worry, we're going to get through this together, you're not alone. You see, posed hands can be super daunting, but all I need you to do is break it down. Trust the process. So let's go through the steps one last time. Step 1, we block in the silhouette. Now this is where step 1 really saves our butt. Because while a line art sketch would have you confused about each phalanx of each finger, the silhouette is only about looking at the overall outline. So instead of drawing in each finger, we're only going to draw the overall shape. Remember, the fingers don't fold into a perfect circle, they're like 3 jelly beans connected by a string. So when you block in a folded finger, remember not to make it look like a thick curve, but rather in 3 separate parts stacked on top of each other. With step 2 this time, we have a challenge, because not only is there a midtone, there is also a very strong highlight to consider. But this is actually a good thing, because this time we can provide a lot more information while still keeping it interesting. So let's first block in some midtones. These are pretty much all on the side of the hand facing us directly. We're going to use these midtones to indicate the separation between the fingers by carving in the upper face of each finger. Once we have those, we're going to pick a lighter, slightly less saturated tone and go back in to add highlights. This time we're looking at the parts of the hand that are facing upwards. So the areas of the palm and fingertips that are slightly further away from us and are facing towards the sky. Again, instead of painting it all flat and then adding in the folds with a dark tone, we're going to use the highlight and midtones to indicate the folds and lines in the hand, kind of like painting negative space. But there is one more thing to consider in this particular reference: subsurface scattering. I explained this in detail on my skin painting tutorial, which you've probably already watched, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but we're going to look at the parts around the edges of the hand where you see a super bright orangey red hue. So this is on the lower edge of the thumb, at the intersection of the thumb and the forefinger, and on the insides of both the middle and the ring finger. We're going to make a new layer and set it to soft light blending mode. Then with a soft airbrush and a bright reddish orange, we're going to lightly airbrush in this subsurface scattering. So now with all of that done, we can finally go in and add the tinier details. So we have some super bright lines at the phalangeal joints, the nails and the folds of the palm between the thumb and the forefinger. And this isn't part of the tutorial per se, but I also went in and added the rings on the index and middle fingers, as well as the tattoo and the scar, because details and imperfections are what really sell the realism. So finally, here is hand number 3. Not so scary when you break it down, right? So there we have it. You see, on this channel we look our fears straight in the face and break them down into manageable steps. This tutorial turned out way longer than I'd anticipated, but I really wanted to make sure that we really break it down properly and look at a variety of shapes and forms of the hand. So if you've enjoyed this video, then please remember to give me a big thumbs up and hit that subscribe button down below if you haven't done so already. Check out my other art tutorials. I'll leave a link to one up here. You can check that out now. Comment below if there are any tutorials you'd like for me to make, and I'll add it to my ever-growing list of tutorials to do on this channel. But with all of that said, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope it's been as much fun for you as it has been for me. And I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye!